Dear friends, good evening. It is with great pleasure that I extend my thanks to Professor Alberto Garcia, Dean of the Faculty of Bioethics, and Professor Father Joseph Tam for directing us and guiding us this evening in this conversation. My greetings to all participants in this second encounter of the webinar series of the Cultural Observatory of Bioethics. Welcome one and all. It is my sincere conviction that the monthly webinar events of the Cultural Observatory of Bioethics, sponsored by the Bioethics faculty, are an important forum for fostering meaningful conversations concerning the sensitive ethical, scientific, and social issues of bioethics that affect today's society, such as the topic about genome editing technologies that will be discussed today. In a few months, we will celebrate the 30th anniversary of the founding of our Pontifical Athenaeum. And within that horizon, I would like to recall that the mission of the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum is to form Christian leaders from all walks of life, yet who are committed to imbuing society with a Christian spirit, offering answers to the theoretical and existential questions of today, in fidelity to the pastors of the Church. The Cultural Observatory of the Faculty of Bioethics plays an integral part in fulfilling this mission by offering a constructive conversation, a critical conversation concerning today's most pressing issues. I think both words in the expression constructive criticism are important. On the one hand, this series of webinars offers a critique of cultural phenomenon insofar as it aims to interpret and judge the scientific, ethical, and social aspects of technologies and policies that affect the life and health of individuals and peoples. At the same time, it intends to propose a constructive criticism, since its aim is to propose actions rooted in gospel values within the living tradition of the Church, as interpreted by the Church's pastors, and sensitive to the signs of the times. Nearly 10 years ago, Pope Francis, in his first major document, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, reflected on human fulfillment by quoting Romano Guardini, quote, "The only measure for properly evaluating an age is to ask to what extent it fosters the development and attainment of a full and authentically meaningful human existence, in accordance with the peculiar character and the capacities of that age," end quote. The topic of today's conversation, recent advances in human genome editing, is without a doubt one of the peculiar characters and capacities of our present times. Questions arise, however, concerning the ways in which this technology is directed to fostering a full and authentically meaningful human existence. And for whom? For all, or for only a select few? What are the proper uses of this technology? Of what possible misuses should we be aware? In what ways does biotechnology require the input of other disciplines to determine what constitutes a full and authentically meaningful human existence? To begin this conversation, we are honored to have with us this evening Professor Peter Mills, Associate Director of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. Based in London, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics aims to inform policy and public debate through timely consideration of the ethical questions raised by biological and medical research, so that the benefits to society are realized in a way that is consistent with public values. Professor Mills joined the council in 2011, where as part of the senior management team, he is responsible for leading council projects and inquiries and speaking on behalf of the council on a range of ethical issues. I think it is very clear that Professor Mills and the approach of the Nuffield Council is very much in line with what I just mentioned of Pope Francis and of our own Pontifical Athenaeum. So to him, I extend my heartfelt thanks for accepting our invitation and for the remarks that he will share with us all. arising from his expertise and proven professionalism. Undoubtedly, we will emerge enriched from a conversation which we will begin this evening, but must continue and carry on in other contexts as well. Thank you all again for joining us, and to the organizers for inviting us to reflect upon this interesting and relevant topic.
Thank you, Father David. So without further ado, since you've made the introduction of Pete, our friend, we just probably go straight into the discussion since time is a little bit limited. So Pete and I went back to 2018, I think, when we met in Hong Kong. There was the second summit. As you know, there are 3 summits organized by different national academies of sciences. The Royal one from the UK, the American one, and also the Chinese one. So we met in the one in Hong Kong in 2018. And then also just 2 months ago, we met also in London again. This was the last, the third summit. They think it will be the last summit on gene editing. So maybe Pete, you could tell us about your impressions of these summits, especially this last one, and what are the news or the novelties or any comments about this latest summit.
Thank you, Father Joseph. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to your seminar today, and congratulations on the 30th anniversary of your university. I note that, of course, this year is the 50th anniversary of the discovery in the UK of the structure of DNA. Sorry, the 70th anniversary of that, and almost the 50th anniversary of a conference in the US at Asilomar on recombinant DNA techniques. And it's very much in the tradition of that conference that I think that conference in the US, that the summits on human genome editing have been situated. In fact, in his opening remarks at the 3rd summit in February, it was David Baltimore who was a participant, a prime mover in the Asilomar conference in 1975, who basically made that connection and suggested that this series of summits is really very much about science and the way in which science governs itself, but is transparent and accountable to the broader society. So, I mean, there are 3 summits on human genome editing. I wonder whether it's worth just very briefly giving a little bit of context about the range of technologies that we are talking about. I mean, genome editing has been around for a while, but the summits, I think, were precipitated by the description in 2012 of CRISPR genome editing techniques. And at that time, I think there was a great deal of excitement about how they would enable much faster progress to be made in right across biology, and the Nuffield Council in particular took that very seriously. And we've ourselves produced a series of reports looking at potential fields of application, not only in basic research in human clinical uses but also in reproductive uses and in animals, in environmental contexts, and even in security and military contexts. So it's a really important technology, and it has had a significant and transformative effect on the pace of research in the biosciences. So I think it's probably right that was recognized in these conferences. Now, I mean, so the first one in 2015, I didn't attend. It was in the US, and the reason I didn't attend it is that I was at a parallel meeting of the Council of Europe at the same time, actually discussing genome editing there in Strasbourg. But I think that was a really sort of foundational moment, in that it, in the spirit of the Asilomar conference, it kind of opened the doors of science or of the key researchers to a variety of other people who had perspectives on how that science should be used. And I think the other significant thing about it was that it was organized jointly by the US National Academies of Sciences, the Royal Society in the UK, but also the Chinese Academy of Science. Fast forward 3 years and we find ourselves in Hong Kong. And of course, that was a very dramatic event for reasons that we can come onto and talk about in a minute. But again, that was a meeting where, once again, science sort of opened its doors to the non-scientific observers and societal interests. But it was completely dominated, in fact, by a revelation that was made at the time about the use of genome editing in human beings for the first time. And we, as I say, we can talk about that. And that legacy, I think, continued into the third summit, which should have taken place, I think, in 2021 or 2022, but because of the pandemic, that didn't happen. There was an online meeting in 2022. But when it came to the summit in 2023, I think there was a very kind of self-conscious effort to move the discussion away from the area of human heritable genome editing. In other words, modifying the human germline to produce changes in offspring that could be inherited by future generations, and to concentrate on fairly, well, notionally more straightforward therapeutic applications. And there were a number of, I mean, you asked me what had changed. I mean, I think in relation to the first summit, the technology was relatively new, but was being applied very broadly, and there was a lot of work and a lot of advances being made in the understanding of basic biology. In the second one, of course, we had that momentous announcement of the use of genome editing to produce in the production of 2 children. But it was very clear in condemning that everybody was absolutely certain that the technology was not ready for use in humans at that time. In the intervening years, a number of somatic treatments to tackle existing disease had taken place. And I think up to probably about 200 people now, in one way or another, have received a gene editing therapy of one kind or another. But that's much more concerned with gene disruption. The idea of gene correction, I think, in the intervening years has been discovered to be more complex, more difficult, perhaps, than it was thought to be. So now there's perhaps even more of a wariness about those applications than there was even at the previous conference in 2018, the previous summit in 2018. So what did we discover? I mean, we discovered that new techniques. This is an evolving area of science. New techniques are developing all the time, and we heard about the developments in moving away from the kind of initial CRISPR techniques, about the development of prime editing and base editing, and the potential application in therapy. So what's the importance of the summits? I mean, I think they continue to offer that perspective, that sort of window into science, and an ability for those who are the sort of elite scientists working in this area to attend to voices from elsewhere about how that science should be conducted and what its aims should be. But it's still under the tutelage, it seems to me, of the kind of scientific elite. So it's not, you find it's not always a terribly well balanced dialogue, and I think that's one of the areas that is potentially of most interest.
Yeah, Pete, I remember like one of the things that I noticed, obviously is on everybody's mind is about the 2018 announcement by this Chinese scientist Jin Kui of creation of 2 and eventually 3 babies using CRISPR. I remember one of the questions there was about whether scientists could self-regulate, right?
Yeah.
It was kind of, I think in 2015 they thought we could do that, and then 2018 they thought, well, not so sure. And then we're back to 2023, and they're reaffirming that self-regulation is the way to go. The scientists should self-regulate, meaning that they don't need more regulation from outside the scientific enterprise to tell them what they should not do and not to do. I mean, that's a little bit of my impression. What do you think? Is this kind of impression about what's best way to regulate or not to regulate scientific development, especially in regards to something so novel like gene editing with such a great impact for humanity? So what do you think? I mean, we can talk about the Chinese case later, but I mean, that's related to the whole issue of whether science can or cannot self-regulate.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to distinguish a little bit between the use of certain techniques within basic and preclinical research, and maybe preclinical research is a separate category. But the use of certain techniques in order to make discoveries within biological sciences, and the use of those same techniques in order to treat living human individuals or potentially future people, or to bring about the birth of future people. I don't think anybody has argued that the latter should be done outside a regulated environment. Each of the summits has ended with a statement from the organizing committee, and the committee's been, there have been sort of similar characters, but few changes, but it's been coming from a fairly similar place. But one of the two really kind of consistent things about that have been always in each case a call for more research to understand better the underlying mechanisms that are involved in biological processes and in altering those biological processes through these genome editing technologies, and at the same time a call for regulation of their therapeutic or reproductive use in human beings. In the middle of that, though, there is something rather peculiar happened, and it struck me that the reaction to the announcement of the birth of the children following the treatments provided by He Jiankui in China was a little peculiar, because it was almost at that moment a kind of reaffirmation of what you say about this willingness and desire of science to regulate itself and not to be regulated by society in any way. And this is seems to me to be a peculiar thing, because of course, in relation to the development of new biological techniques, scientists have particular kind of expertise. But when it comes to the aims and the purposes of using those techniques, then the scientists are no more expert and have no more of a claim to authority than anybody else in society. And that is where you need to have that broader engagement. Now, one of the things about the summits that is peculiar is that, in a sense, there are sort of two meetings happening in one venue. One is a kind of scientific conference that showcases developments in the techniques, and the other is a kind of debate on science, on what science should be doing, on what the aims of the use of those techniques should be. And sometimes they kind of engage with each other, and sometimes they seem to sort of pass without really getting to grips. So in the second summit, so the first summit, the organizer, it's worth looking at those kind of three statements that came out of the organizing committees. Following the first one, there was as I've said, a call for more research, call for regulation, an acknowledgement that the techniques were not ready for use in humans at that time, but that they could be in the future, and a call for no treatments to go ahead in the absence of a societal consensus having been reached about how they should be used, certainly in relation to reproductive uses. But then when we hear about the reproductive uses actually taking place, there is a statement that says the science is not ready for this. But rather than saying, okay, we'll put call a halt to it, the recommendation is that in view of the progress that has been made, there should be an effort to define a translational pathway actually to bring about in a proper way, in a properly regulated way, the kind of treatment that has happened in an unregulated, undisciplined and irresponsible way that was described at that event. So what has happened really is it seems to me or what is being done through that is the scientists there saying, actually, there is good science and bad science. That was bad science, but you still need to trust us to do the good science, and we'll set out a pathway. And anybody who's on that pathway, you can trust them. But anybody who is not on that pathway is by definition sort of outside the definition of good science and shouldn't be allowed to proceed. And that led then to a further piece of work by what we can call the International Commission, that was again set up by the Republic of Science, by the Royal Society in the UK, by the National Academies of Science and Medicine in the US, and they carried out I think a year or so long inquiry precisely to define that pathway, to define that translational pathway, all the time sort of bracketing this the need for this kind of societal discussion about how those techniques should be used, but you end up basically creating a sort of pathway to the destination that then and then you say, okay, well, we can get there, so can we do it? Before you've actually had a good kind of discussion about whether or not that is even a desirable destination. I think that kind of attitude permeates a lot of the discussions around
right. So it's kind of like putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
You're asking like whether we should do this or not, and then decide if we should do it. Then what are the rules and so on? But they're saying that let's put that question aside, whether we should do it or not, whether society wants it or not. You just kind of go ahead and pretend that no, the society wants it, and so we go ahead and say what would it be like, and then the society on their own. So I wonder if there's kind of like almost like a hidden agenda. If they really want it, maybe this is a scientific mentality that they really want it. They really think this is good, and I think there is a little bit of optimism. I mean, in some of the organizers there, you mentioned Baltimore, and then Lord Church is very much an optimist, and even Bailey, who is the dean of Harvard Medical School, is also very along that same line. I wonder if that was kind of like I mean, the way the scientists think and work. I mean, they just kind of don't want any type of ethical boundaries, or at least maybe not boundaries, but something to hold them back. I wonder if you agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right in respect of research, but I think what is the missing piece of the missing set of considerations is about the extent to which pursuing this research creates a kind of momentum towards realizing it in particular ways. It doesn't, it treats that scientific pursuit as something that is very pure, which is entirely about knowledge, whilst bracketing out the question entirely of how it intersects with the world and how actually having that knowledge puts a kind of pressure or a kind of frame on how it will eventually get used. So I think you end up moving from the question of, for example, why should we have this? Why should we pursue this? To the question of, okay, now we've got it. How should we use it? And that really kind of changes the frame in which you ask the question. So it moves from a question of why do this to a question of why not, actually.
Right.
And that really puts the kind of ethical and I mean I was coming from an organization whose role is to kind of think about bioethical questions. I always think that it's really problematic that ethics is always cast in the role of the kind of putting on a brake or raising obstructions, rather than actually being able to kind of steer the direction in which collectively we sort of move forward to a future that we all have to share.
Right. You also mentioned in some way, I guess that's why I think they also try to move the emphasis not on the whole debates on gene editing, on basically on we call the germline, and going to something much more, I guess, shareable and much more concrete, which is the somatic cells. They mentioned a lot of that in this third summit, especially treatment of sickle cell disease. And probably you might have something to say about that, and also new advances in gene editing in plants, animals, and other things that are going on in that summit, or in the reports that the scientists are giving. What were the ones that you find most exciting and interesting?
Yeah, well, I certainly, I mean, as I say, after the events in Hong Kong in 2018, there was a very deliberate intention on the part of the organizers to focus as much as possible of the next summit on, well, away from reproductive genome editing and towards the somatic applications, but it's also an area in which, as I say, a lot of progress have been made, and in the meantime there have been a number of clinical trials, and at the summit we were very privileged to hear from a patient, the first patient actually in the US, who had been treated with a genome editing based gene therapy that had basically cured her of sickle cell disease. So at a kind of technical level, that was extremely exciting, and it was astonishing to hear the personal testimony of somebody who had been relieved of those really terrible symptoms. But then, I mean, there was a kind of motif or a sort of trope throughout that day that was devoted to, there was a whole session devoted to sickle cell disease as a single disease, but also that those 2 days that were really focused on the basic science and the somatic applications. That was about, it was the motif was something like, our objective is to have a safe, effective, one-shot, curative, and affordable therapy and lots of the science was brilliant. You know, that they'd done a lot of work on the safe, on the effective, the one shot. I mean, this sickle cell treatment was a demonstration that with one intervention, somebody could walk away cured of sickle cell disease, and curative, but everything founded on this question of affordability, because these are hyper expensive treatments available only to people in extremely fortunate circumstances. This was a woman who'd received that treatment in the US. I can't remember the exact cost, but it was millions of dollars. So the discussion then turned to how could this, you know, this kind of treatment, is the cost going to fall to the extent that it is available to all those who need it? And when you talk about a disease like sickle cell disease, those who could benefit from it are widely dispersed and most of them in parts of the world where they don't have access to the kind of level of healthcare that somebody living in the US at present does. So again, what was really interesting about that discussion was that it was very much framed again from the scientific perspective. It's like, you know, we have discovered or invented these kind of technologies. Now, how do we make them available and affordable to people who could consume them effectively? So the discussions were of two sorts, really. One was a kind of was the sort of social and economic solution to that problem, which was all about how you creatively change the sort of IP arrangements to make you know, provide effective reimbursement for the people who develop them. And the other part of the discussion was a kind of technological one, which was saying, well, can we get genome editing as a new technology to the point where it is effectively a kind of general purpose technology that doesn't require specific you know, expensive, long clinical trials and research and development process for every single application, but it becomes a kind of general purpose technology, or elements of it anyway, become a kind of general purpose technology that we can just repurpose for a range of patients and reduce the cost. But both of those solutions were not really solutions to the problem, because if the problem is really about how these things originate within a particular kind of sort of innovation system that has science at one end and then attempts to kind of sell the you know, and then the development through a kind of commercial process that ends up trying to sort of sell it out of the other end. And I think a lot of the kind of frustration, for all the talk of participation, for all the engagement with the various publics that were there, a lot of the frustration came out of the fact that the scientists who were there didn't kind of get and weren't willing to open up to the possibility that other people could frame the aims of the research and the way in which these techniques get developed. So it was all about, you know, the techniques are protected, the research is protected. When we have it, then we have to, you know, kind of find a way of doing something. There wasn't any opening up of kind of participation in the framing of the science and in the conduct of the basic science. And I think that was a frustration.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of the speakers, I'm not sure it's from India, she was saying that, like, they actually had a drug that's been around for 30, 40 years that actually takes away a lot of the symptoms of sickle cell crises. And I mean, most people can afford that drug. So we're talking about something much more easy to use, and it's been around. And the question is not really technology, it's also all the other things implied in getting the drug down to, you know, the ones who need it. And that is in some way a scientific question, but it's like not just basic science question.
Yeah.
And the recent what they've seen with the pandemic is kind of similar about delivery of the vaccines, right? So when you have something so widely available and cost effective, like I mean, there's some vaccines that were not too expensive, and we had difficulty making it available to all the people who need them. So, I mean, so I think it's something that I think we have to talk about more, but it's such a bigger problem than what we used to address it, because it requires so much more like international collaboration, all that, and I don't see that. I don't see that happening. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. And also, I mean, the response to that is, you know, you don't ask people what they need, because you know, it's the old sort of Henry Ford thing. You know, if you ask people what they need, they'll say faster horses. People don't see the new technologies coming down the road. But by the same token, you know, you're asking the wrong question if you're asking what kind of technology do you need. It's about starting with the challenge that you're facing and thinking, how can science be a human practice that addresses the, you know, in the kind of old Baconian way, you know, the relief of man's estate, you know, how can it answer to those really kind of fundamental challenges, rather than saying, okay, well, we're just going to do science and then see what we can do with it.
Mm-hmm. Hey, are there any other advances that that's close to your heart?
Oh gosh, I mean, I didn't talk very much about genome editing in farmed animals, but in the UK, people maybe know, we have recently passed a new act of parliament to enable genome edited farm animals and genome edited plants to be produced and marketed in the UK in a way that was prevented by the regulations surrounding genetically modified organisms, GM, the GM regulations. And that's something that we've been working on quite a lot, just because a lot of the discussion around that was focused very much on the risk of these things. Are they likely, the risk to consumers actually, you know, are these things likely to poison people or hurt people? And very little on the implications, particularly the implications for other living organisms, for animals, which is where we did a piece of work, particularly the ethical considerations surrounding animal welfare, but also the environmental application, the environmental implications, and particularly the environmental implications of a technology that can really accelerate the industrialization of agriculture along particular kinds of lines. So that's certainly one thing that we've been thinking about a lot. But beyond that, I mean, once again, I mean, my sort of real background is in human reproduction and embryology as a regulator, and you may have seen that we had an announcement just last week that children have been born following mitochondrial donation in the UK, and that's an area that is developing now, and also potentially through a consultation that may lead in the fullness of time to more liberal rules under the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act, because in the UK, of course, we are, I guess, among the more sort of liberal countries in that respect.
But this is more about, I mean, hearing about news about called the 3-parent embryo.
We don't call them that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's how the news talk about it, even though the mitochondrial is only less than 1% genetic makeup. What was the story about? I mean, I know that the UK has approved that in 2018.
Yeah.
But they haven't, this is the first time they had it.
It's, I mean, it's a bit of a mystifying story in a way, and it all arises from an inquiry that was made by a journalist to the regulator who hold deep data on the treatments. I mean, I was in the habit of asking them, sort of every year, have we had any cycles? Have we had any babies? And they would always give me the same, well, not the same response, but they would always give me a response that said, so-and-so, this many treatments have been licensed, this many cycles have taken place, and the number of children born is fewer than 5, including 0. From which you can conclude that there is 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 out there. And the reason they didn't want to give a specific number was to protect the privacy of the individuals concerned. And that's, so far as I know, the information that was given to the journalist, but it does seem to have been corroborated by in some way that I'm not aware of, that there has actually been a birth. In other words, that number is not 0, it's 1, 2, 3, or 4. But that's all we know. The story hasn't really gone anywhere. And what's slightly unsatisfactory about it is the way in which that information has come out through a journalistic inquiry rather than through a kind of scientific paper that could describe the program. And also, I mean, they've licensed, I think, upwards of 30 treatments now in this clinic, and really I think it's probably important to understand how those 30 odd treatments, if they've taken place, have gone, and what the consequences of those have been, as well as the birth of the child. But I think we will find out in the fullness of time when they publish their findings. Because
I know that the Nuffield report on that mitochondrial replacement therapy is one of the things that they asked for, is that basically there will be accountability and safety and kind of reporting system in place, so that if this technology goes ahead, there will be kind of accountability. And so this is something I think should be followed up. But in some way, who is in charge of that? Is it the human fertilization?
So it cannot. So what happened in the UK is that back in 2015, the law was changed through regulations to make it possible to carry out mitochondrial donation through potentially 2 specified procedures, subject to a license from the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, which is the regulator. And they proceeded very, very cautiously. So they first licensed, they did a process to elaborate their guidance on this. They licensed a clinic who had done a lot of research around this, and they licensed practitioners, and then they issued licenses on a named patient basis for these kind of 30 now people who have been allowed to do it. So they proceeded very, very cautiously, and this is all, of course, following some expert group reports on the science that they convened prior to the passing of the regulations. But we've heard nothing really since 2018 about that. And as I say, I used to ask them every year, what more can you say about this? And got a very similar response, which, I mean, inevitably this is going to be this is a new treatment. I can't remember. I heard the other day somebody say how many treatments had taken place in order to produce the first IVF baby in 1978, and that was an awful lot of treatments, in the hundreds. So you wouldn't expect this to be something that would just kind of work straight away. The thing, obviously, that you've got to do is make sure that you're not doing any significant harm in the first place, at least to any children who would be born as a result. But as far as the success rate, you would expect it to be very small. But
well, we have 10 minutes left. I don't see any questions on the chat. So those who are listening in, if you have any questions for Pete, you can type it in the chat. Meanwhile, maybe one question that we've been talking about which is all kind of wrapped up in this, is question about governance and international governance. How do you foresee a possible international governance, given the fact that policies are different from country to country?
Yeah.
And how do you somehow achieve that in a way that like countries would buy into it and will have that to make it enforceable as well? How do you foresee this kind of governance happening?
Yeah. So there was I mean, I've been very interested in and have worked with organizations, international organizations like and particularly international human rights organizations like UNESCO, like the Council of Europe in Europe, and WHO. Around the genome editing particularly, there was a real sort of polarization of views about whether or not, once the prospect was first raised, there should be a global moratorium on certainly the reproductive use of those treatments, or whether or not there should be a sort of case by case or country by country regulation. I think one thing that everybody agreed on is that there should be regulation, and actually the Nuffield Council, along with the French and German counterparts, called a few years ago now for everybody at least to bring those kind of treatments within the scope of public regulation, and to make their abuse subject to appropriate sanction. Now, what constitutes abuse is something that's still to be determined. I mean, I think the institutions, the human rights institutions and the human rights framework provides a really kind of interesting venue for exploring the differences between countries, and a place where it's possible to potentially arrive at a kind of acceptable set of differences in outlook. I think I mean, the problem is that, of course, that people who want to do things that they're not allowed to do will always look for somewhere to do them. So given that there is no global authority that is capable of doing it, and whatever UNESCO says, whatever the WHO, well, whatever a global authority might, a global institution might say, people are always going to find ways around that. The WHO response, I think, was quite interesting, because what they suggested was not that you should pass laws, which, by the way, are all highly ambiguous because they need to be, because they're at a very high level, but really try to kind of galvanize through leadership a kind of consensus amongst states. Not that there was a single answer to this, but that there would be kind of tolerable. There was an agreement that these things that there was a need for supervision, regulation everywhere, and that within that certain people would, at an appropriate time, take a different, potentially different path through it. But yeah, I mean, the sort of global statements are really quite interesting, because it certainly seemed to me for a long time that despite apparently being very skeptical, for example, about human germline genetic modification, there is the consensus that exists is a consensus, a kind of temporizing consensus. In other words, a consensus that the science isn't good enough, so we shouldn't let it happen. But insofar as there is a moral consensus about the purposes that should be permitted, that moral consensus doesn't necessarily extend, I don't think, to all possible uses. In the case of UNESCO, it's to uses insofar as they may violate human dignity, and insofar as the Council of Europe, it seems to me, it's about whilst there was certainly a lot of discussion in framing that legal instrument about whether or not there might be permissible purposes, but it was parked because the technology itself was not available. And when I mean, I was involved recently in a drafting group of the Council of Europe to clarify Article 13, which contains a prohibition of modifying, intentionally creating modifications that could be passed on.
That's the Oviedo Convention.
That's the Oviedo Convention, yeah, the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, which is, you know, binding law in 47 countries, or actually 29 that have ratified it, but the 47 states party to the Council of Europe. But even there, I mean, it seems to me there are things that weren't there are certain ambiguities, for example, about mitochondrial donation that we touched on earlier, and to what extent the language that is around genetic modification applies to reconstructing a cell with elements from other places, as opposed to actually interfering with the sequence of bases in a DNA molecule. And that distinction sort of allows the question about mitochondrial donation, for example, to be parked a little bit.
Good. I don't see any more questions from the audience. I'm running out of questions. Do you have anything you want to say to end this? Yeah.
Gosh, I don't. What have we touched on? Well, I mean, I'd like to ask you, I guess, a similar question about how. I mean, I know you and I, Father Joseph, have sort of met and spoken on a number of occasions about this, and certainly about human genome editing. And I'm curious as to whether or not there are kind of debates, live debates about and what the context of those debates are in relation to the human genome and its relationship to human dignity and its relationship to maybe this is opening up much too big a question for the last 5 minutes.
I mean, I think from the Catholic position, since we are somewhat basically negative about the use of IVF and creation of embryos, so many of these questions are already kind of like no need to address in some way, because it's like a lot of that is already like mitochondrial, the about these have to go through IVF. So basically, the church doesn't need to say anything about it because it's already not allowed. So the most interesting part would be somatic gene editing. I guess for the reasons of not therapy, because I think everybody would agree that if you use it to cure some of sickle cell disease, that would be something good and laudable. But when it comes to like enhancement, which is a complicated, also controversial name, whether that is allowed, right? That is the other question that I think we need to go deeper into. And also there is not, I don't think there's that much reflection on that either about how do you.
So a sort of genetic vaccine, if you like, you know, I mean, which wouldn't, strictly speaking, be treating a disease, but would prepare somebody with a resistance to an endemic disease in a. This is where the genome editing application was used, right? I mean, initially to create a resistance to an endemic HIV virus.
So I mean, there will be a spectrum, because that's why the therapy enhancement division is not very clear, because sometimes you actually go from one to the other, and as technology advances, the boundary becomes blurred. So
I mean, for what it's worth, it seems to me that that is a really unprofitable distinction to pursue, because you know it doesn't help you. I mean, the route that I've always taken is to ask what is a reasonable, what is a good reason to use a particular kind of technology, and that's a question that falls to be addressed in a situated way in a particular kind of context.
Yeah, the other thing that to end this, that was in the summit that for me was interesting is gene editing on the gametes. I mean, about the sperm, for example. There might be a little leeway by which Catholics would be allowed to do that. So basically, you modify if it is a paternally carrier of a genetic disease, and you can change the gamete, right, internally. So basically, that could be one way that would be acceptable to the Catholic Church. And how would we address that? That is quite interesting from my perspective. I don't think there's enough being talked about it in the Catholic bioethical world because the technology is still so new. So, but that would be an area that we could explore further.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting because there are two questions there. One is about the kind of transmission of an inherited genome, and the other is about this question of the relationship between, and this is what I was trying to get to with the question about the relationship between the genome and identity and dignity, and that's an area that I think needs a lot more reflection, but beyond the scope of today's discussion, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Pete, for your participation, and hope you have a good weekend. And
it's a pleasure. You too.
Continue this kind of collaboration and in the future. Thanks very much, and thank you all for attending. I think this will be put on YouTube later on, so you could watch it again for those who couldn't make it today and want to watch it later. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.